The music at the grand gala didn't stop, but the air definitely froze. When Hyun Jae-yu stepped into the hall, the room went silent. He didn't just walk through the crowd, he parted it. To the trembling elites, he was the Silver Wolf, a ruthless monster to be feared. But beneath the tailored tuxedo and the terrifying tattoos, he was a hollow shell. He wasn't here for the art. He was here because he had nothing to lose. 10 years ago, the doctors had given him a life sentence worse than prison, completely sterile. He was a king with no heir, a dead man walking. He turned to leave, disgusted by the pointless luxury, until a flash of royal blue stopped him dead. Jemima. She didn't cower like the others. She glided past him, radiant and calm, smelling of jasmine and life. The moment she was close, the impossible happened. A violent, painful throb kicked him in the gut, a biological shockwave his body hadn't felt in a decade. Jae-yu grabbed the edge of a table, his breath hitching in his throat. The doctors said he was broken. The science said it was impossible. But as his body screamed in reaction to her presence, he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't dead yet, and she was the only cure. The champagne in Hyun Jae-yu's hand was vintage, expensive, and tasted entirely like ash. He stood near a marble pillar at the edge of the Seoul Arts Center's grand ballroom, watching the city's elite pretend to care about abstract expressionism. They were vultures in silk and diamonds, but the moment he had stepped through the double doors, the vultures had scattered. He could feel their eyes on him, nervous, terrified glances darting toward his neck where the silver ink of a wolf's maw peeked above his tuxedo collar. They called him the Silver Wolf, a monster who had carved the underworld into his own personal kingdom. But looking out at the sea of hollow smiles, Jae-yu felt less like a king and more like a ghost haunting his own funeral. What was the point of it all? The territory, the money, the fear. It all ended with him. The doctors had been clinically brutal 10 years ago, sterile. His bloodline was a dead end. Every breath he took felt like a waste of oxygen, a delay of the inevitable. He set his glass down on a passing tray with a force that made the waiter flinch, ready to leave. He had seen enough. Then the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift in gravity. The crowd near the entrance parted, not out of fear this time, but out of sheer, magnetic reverence. She walked in like a storm contained in silk. She was a striking contrast to the pale, terrified faces around her, a black woman of regal elegance, her skin glowing under the crystal chandeliers. She wore a dress of royal blue that seemed to absorb all the light in the room, clinging to a figure that was both soft and commanding. Jae-yu froze. His cynical boredom evaporated, replaced by a confusion that bordered on irritation. Who was she? She moved through the gallery with a calm, confident stride, stopping to examine a painting just 10 feet away from him. Most people trembled when they got this close to the Silver Wolf. She didn't even look at him. She simply existed, poised and serene. Then the wind shifted. The scent of her, jasmine, dark vanilla, and something fiercely alive, hit him. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A sharp, hot throb kicked him in the lower abdomen, buckling his knees. It wasn't a gentle flutter of attraction. It was a physical assault. Air hissed through his teeth as he gripped the marble pillar for support. His heart, which had beaten with a slow, flat rhythm for years, suddenly hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Impossible. The word screamed in his mind. The doctors had shown him the charts. The damage was absolute. He was supposed to be numb, a biological dead zone. Yet as he stared at the curve of her neck, a fire roared through his veins, primal and agonizingly potent. The dormant parts of him weren't just waking up, they were rioting. Jae-yu pressed a hand to his stomach, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. She was just a woman looking at art, but to him, she was a terrifying miracle. The dead king was breathing again, and he had no idea what to do with the life she had just forced back into him. The elevator doors to the penthouse hissed open, revealing a sprawling expanse of glass and cold, gray marble. Hyun Jae-yu stormed into the silence of his fortress, ripping the silk tie from his neck as if it were a noose. The panoramic view of Seoul glittered below him, a city of millions that he owned, yet felt entirely disconnected from. He went straight to the bar, his movements sharp and agitated. He poured a glass of whiskey, abandoning the crystal stopper on the counter, and downed it in one burn. He waited. He waited for the heat to spread, for the alcohol to blur the sharp, terrifying edges of what had happened at the gala. But the whiskey just sat heavy in his stomach. The electric throb that had nearly brought him to his knees an hour ago was fading, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache of a dead man. It was a fluke, he muttered to the empty room. Adrenaline, stress. He needed to prove it. He needed to prove that his body hadn't just betrayed 10 years of medical certainty for a stranger in a blue dress. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts, women, beautiful, willing, and safe. He forced his mind to conjure images of past lovers, of desire, of anything that might spark that fire again. He focused on the memory of skin, of touch, of the things that drove normal men to madness. Nothing. His body remained a fortress of ice. The silence in his veins was absolute. The silver wolf was just as broken as he had been this morning. The despair crashed over him, heavier than before, because for a fleeting second he had tasted hope. He squeezed his eyes shut, exhaling a ragged breath. Immediately, the image of her floated behind his eyelids, the curve of her neck against the royal blue silk, the calm, steady grace of her hands, the scent of jasmine and life. Thump! His heart kicked against his ribs, violent and hard. The heat didn't just return, it flared, hot and possessive, tightening his gut. Jae-yu gripped the edge of the granite bar, his knuckles turning white. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a miracle, it was her. The realization terrified him more than the infertility ever had. He wasn't fixed, he was tethered. He was a starving man who had found the only source of food in the world, and he didn't even know her name. He set the glass down with a precise, dangerous click. The panic in his chest solidified into something cold and familiar, resolve. If he couldn't understand the miracle, he would capture it. He tapped a speed dial number on his phone. It rang once. "Boss," the voice on the other end was rough, confused by the late hour. "The woman in the blue dress at the Arts Center gala," Jae-yu said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low that promised violence. "Jemima Ainsley. I want a dossier on my desk by sunrise. Where she lives, where she works, who she speaks to, everything." "Understood. Is she a target?" Jae-yu looked out at the city lights, his reflection in the glass looking back at him like a stranger. "No," he whispered, "she's the only thing that matters." The sunlight streaming into the LSP's gallery felt intrusive, too bright for a man who lived in the shadows. Hyun Jae-yu adjusted his sunglasses, stepping across the threshold. The delicate chime of the door announce sounded like a warning siren. The effect was immediate. The gallery manager, a slight man with nervous hands, dropped a stack of brochures. A couple viewing a sculpture near the window abruptly decided they needed to be elsewhere, shuffling out with heads bowed. They knew the suit. They knew the tattoos. They knew that when the silver wolf entered a room, oxygen usually left it. Jae-yu ignored them all. He wasn't here for intimidation, though it clung to him like cologne. He was hunting, but his prey wasn't an enemy. He found her near the back, adjusting the lighting on a massive, chaotic canvas. Jemima. She wasn't wearing the royal blue dress today. Instead, she was dressed in sharp, professional black trousers and a crisp white blouse. The severity of the outfit should have made her cold, but the warmth of her skin and the grace of her movements softened the stark lines. She turned, sensing eyes on her. When she saw him, she didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply unclipped a pen from her pocket and walked toward him, her heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the polished floor. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was low and melodic, cutting through the tense silence of the room. "Welcome to LS Base. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Jiayu felt the tension in his shoulders, a permanent state of combat readiness, simply dissolve. It was baffling. Being near her was like stepping out of a freezing blizzard into a warm room. The violent throb in his gut from last night had settled into a steady, comforting hum, a reassurance that he was alive. He realized he had been starring too long. He needed to speak. He needed a reason to be here that didn't sound like madness. His eyes darted to the nearest wall. It held a painting that looked like a violent explosion of neon vomit, abstract, aggressive, and hideous. "That one," Jiayu said, his voice rougher than he intended. Jemima turned, her eyebrows raising slightly as she looked at the monstrosity. "The chaos of urban decay. It's a very bold choice. It speaks to the fragmentation of the modern soul." It speaks to a headache, Jiayu thought, but he stepped closer, desperate to keep her talking. He wanted to hear the cadence of her voice, to breathe in the faint trace of jasmine that lingered around her. "Tell me about it." She hesitated, perhaps sensing he wasn't the type for art critique, but she remained perfectly professional. She spoke about texture and intent, her hands moving expressively as she explained the artist's vision. Jiayu didn't hear a word of the theory. He was memorizing the way the light caught her eyes, the way she didn't treat him like a monster but like a man. "I'll take it," he interrupted, the moment she paused for breath. Jemima blinked, surprised. "Sir, the price is—" "I don't care about the price," Jiayu said, signaling his driver who was waiting by the door. "Wrap it up, slowly." He hated the painting. He would probably burn it the moment it reached his penthouse. But as she walked to the counter to process the sale, giving him one last polite smile, Jiayu knew he would have bought every hideous canvas in the room just to stay in her orbit for 5 more minutes. Across the street from the gallery, the rain had begun to fall, turning the sole pavement into a slick gray mirror. A nondescript sedan sat idling in the shadows of an alleyway, its wipers motionless. Inside, 2 men with the crimson insignia of the Red Dragon Syndicate tattooed on their necks watched the entrance of LS Space with predatory confusion. 3 hours, the driver muttered, tapping a cigarette against the dashboard. "The wolf doesn't sit still for 3 minutes, let alone 3 hours. Is he washing money?" "Maybe," the passenger replied, squinting through the downpour at the armored Maybach parked like a monolith in front of the glass doors. "Or maybe the rumors are true. Maybe he's lost his teeth." Inside the gallery, Hyun Jiayu was painfully aware of the time. He knew his car parked out front was a beacon, a flag planted in enemy territory inviting a challenge. Every instinct honed over a decade of gang warfare screamed at him to move, to rotate locations, to disappear. But he couldn't stand up. He sat on a velvet viewing bench, staring blankly at a sculpture of twisted bronze. The air here was different. It didn't smell of gunpowder or stale fear. It smelled of her. Jemima moved through the space, organizing a display of modern ceramics. She had stopped being startled by his presence 2 days ago. Now she treated him with a bewildering mix of professional distance and casual acceptance. It was disarming. It was dangerous. "You've been staring at that bronze knot for 40 minutes, Jemima's voice drifted over, soft and amused. "Are you planning to buy it, or are you just trying to intimidate it into straightening out?" Jiayu stiffened. The retort that rose to his throat was sharp, a weaponized dismissal designed to keep people at arm's length. "Mind your business. Walk away." "It's complex," was what actually came out. His voice lacked its usual serrated edge. It sounded tired. Jemima walked over, holding 2 porcelain cups. "Chamomile," she said, extending one toward him. "You look like you haven't slept in a week, Mr. Hyun. Caffeine is the last thing you need." He stared at the delicate cup. A weapon, poison, no, just tea. A simple human kindness. The silver wolf didn't drink chamomile tea with shopkeepers. The silver wolf broke fingers and burned contracts, but Jiayu reached out, his tattooed hand trembling slightly as it brushed against hers. The contact sent that familiar, life-affirming jolt through his wrist, silencing the cold ache in his bones. He took the tea, thank you. The vibrate of the phone in his pocket shattered the moment like a gunshot. Jiayu flinched, spilling a drop of hot liquid on his hand. He pulled the phone out, seeing his lieutenant's name. The real world was clawing its way back in. He answered, his voice dropping instantly into a guttural growl. Speak, and it better be blood or money. He saw Jemima pause, her eyes widening slightly at the sudden shift in his tone, the beast peering out from behind the suit. Jiayu felt a flush of shame, hot and foreign, crawl up his neck. He turned away from her, shielding the violence of his life from her view, realizing with a sinking dread that the armor he had worn for 10 years was no longer bulletproof. It was melting. The streetlights outside the gallery buzzed with a dying yellow hum, casting long, distorted shadows against the brickwork. It was past 9, and the city had turned cold. Hyun Jiayu leaned against the hood of his armored car, a silhouette cut from the darkness itself. The smoke from his cigarette curled upward, disappearing into the night, much like his patience. He shouldn't be here. He knew that. The red dragons were circling, sniffing for weakness, and by standing here, he was painting a target on the only thing in Seoul that made him feel human. But the thought of her walking out into the dark, oblivious to the wolves waiting in the alleyways, was a physical weight he couldn't shake. The lock of the gallery clicked. Jemima stepped out, wrapping a beige trench coat tighter around her frame against the wind. She turned to lock the door, humming a soft tune, completely unaware of how fragile her safety was. When she turned around and saw him, she stopped. She didn't scream, she didn't drop her keys. She just went still, her eyes finding his in the gloom. "Mr. Hyun," she said. Her voice was steady, but he heard the caution in it. "The gallery is closed." "You stay too late," Jiayu said. His voice came out lower than he intended, a gravelly rumble that sounded more like an accusation than concern. He tossed the cigarette to the pavement and crushed it with his heel. "It's reckless." Jemima stiffened, her chin lifting slightly. "I have work to do, and I don't recall my schedule being your concern." Jiayu stepped forward, entering the pool of light where she stood. He saw her eyes flick to the tattoo peeking out from his collar, then back to his face. He wanted to tell her that there were men with knives and debts to settle watching this street. He wanted to tell her that she was the only color in his gray world, and he would burn the city to keep her vibrant. But he didn't know the words for that. He only knew the language of command. "This isn't a game," he snapped, closing the distance until he towered over her. "You walk alone, you follow routines, you make it easy for them." "For them," Jemima stepped closer instead of backing away, forcing him to look down at her. "Or for you, are you threatening me, Mr. Hyun?" "I'm telling you to be smart," he growled, frustration leaking into his tone. "Go home, lock your doors, and don't stop for anyone." It sounded like a threat. He heard it echo in the empty street, harsh and violent. He expected her to run. He expected the fear that everyone else showed him. But Jemima just studied him. She tilted her head, her gaze searching his face, past the scar on his jaw, past the cold fury in his eyes, drilling straight into the wreckage beneath. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "You're shaking," she whispered. Jiayu looked down at his hands. They were clenched into fists at his sides, trembling with the effort of holding back the terror that she might get hurt. "I'm not a threat to you, Jemima," he said, his voice finally breaking, losing its edge. "But everyone else is." "I know," she said softly. She didn't reach out, but her voice touched him. "You aren't trying to scare me. You're just lonely and you don't know how to ask for help." Jiayu felt the air leave his lungs. She had stripped him bare without touching him. Before he could rebuild his walls, she stepped around him toward the curb, pausing only once. "Good night, Jiayu. Get some sleep." She used his given name. It sounded like a prayer. He watched her walk away, realizing with a sinking heart that she hadn't just stood her ground, she had conquered it. The neon skyline of Seoul bled through the rain-streaked windows of Hyun Jae-yu's office, painting the room in hues of bruised purple and electric blue. On his desk lay the dossier he had demanded, photos of Jemima walking to work, buying coffee, smiling at a neighbor. Innocent, vulnerable. He pushed the photos away, disgust rising in his throat. He was becoming exactly what he hated, a predator circling a civilian. He reached for his glass of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the phantom sensation of her touch that still lingered on his skin from the night before. "You're just lonely," she had said. The truth of it had felt like a knife between his ribs. The vibrating hum of his secure line shattered the silence. It was the red phone, the line reserved for war. Jae-yu snatched it up. "Report." "Boss," his lieutenant's voice was tight, breathless. "We intercepted a comms chatter from the Red Dragon sector. They aren't hitting the shipment at the docks." "Where?" Jae-yu demanded, his blood turning to ice. "They think you're laundering money through that gallery in Gangnam. They think the owner is your leverage. They're en route, 3 vans, heavily armed." The glass in Jae-yu's hand shattered. The whiskey mixed with the blood dripping from his palm, but he didn't feel it. "How far out?" 10 minutes, maybe less." Jae-yu didn't hang up. He dropped the phone and was moving before it hit the carpet. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, bursting into the underground garage like a feral animal. His driver started to scramble out of the break room, but Jae-yu shoved past him, diving into the driver's seat of the armored Maybach. "Stay here," he roared, the command echoing off the concrete walls. The engine roared to life, a guttural snarl that matched the one ripping through his own chest. He peeled out of the garage, the tires screaming against the polished floor. 10 minutes. Seoul traffic was a river of steel and apathy. Jae-yu drove like a madman, mounting the curb, weaving through oncoming lanes, blaring the horn. Every second that ticked by was a hammer blow to his heart. The Red Dragons didn't ask questions. They burned. They broke. They sent messages in blood. And Jemima was there alone. A vision of her in the royal blue dress flashed before his eyes, her calm smile, her steady hands, the life she radiated that had jump-started his dead heart. If that light was extinguished, if he let the darkness of his world swallow her. "No," he hissed through gritted teeth, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. He floored the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past 180. The city blurred into streaks of light. The pain in his gut, the biological tether that connected him to her, was flaring again, but this time it wasn't arousal. It was a warning siren. It was a scream. He drifted around the final corner, the tires smoking, and saw the gallery down the street. 3 black vans were already there, idling on the curb. Men in masks were stepping out, baseball bats and incendiary devices in their hands. Jae-yu didn't brake. He shifted gears, the engine screaming as he aimed the 2-ton armored car directly at the lead van. The Silver Wolf had arrived, and he wasn't there to negotiate. The impact sounded like the earth splitting open. Metal shrieked against metal as Jae-yu's armored Maybach slammed into the lead van, sending it skidding across the wet pavement and through the gallery's front window. A shower of tempered glass and twisted steel exploded into the street. Jae-yu kicked his door open before the wheels stopped spinning. He didn't feel the whiplash. He didn't feel the rain. He only felt the blinding, white-hot rage that turned his vision red. He raised his weapon and fired. 2 shots, 2 bodies hitting the wet asphalt. He stepped over them, his expensive Italian shoes crunching on broken glass, and stormed into the gallery. "Jemima," his voice roared, cracking the terrified silence inside. The gallery was a war zone. The Red Dragons were already inside, smashing displays, hunting for the leverage. When they saw the Silver Wolf, they froze, but only for a second. Then the gunfire started. Jayu didn't take cover. He didn't care. The fatalism that had plagued him for years, the wish for death, had transmuted into something far more dangerous, a total disregard for his own survival as long as she lived. He moved through the hail of bullets like a wraith, firing with terrifying precision. A man lunged from behind a sculpture. Jayu put a bullet in his chest, sending him crashing backward into the chaos of urban decay painting. Bright crimson blood splashed across the neon canvas, turning the abstract art into a gruesome reality. Jayu! He heard her scream. It came from the back office. He pivoted, sprinting toward the sound. A red dragon enforcer had kicked the office door in and was raising a jagged, serrated knife, cornering Jemima against the file cabinets. She was holding a letter opener, her hands shaking, but her eyes were fierce. The gunman raised the knife to strike. Jayu was too far away to shoot without risking hitting her. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He launched himself forward, throwing his body between the blade and the woman who had restarted his heart. The collision was brutal. He felt the cold punch of steel before he felt the pain. The knife meant for her throat buried itself deep into his side, scraping against a rib. The breath left his lungs in a guttural hiss. But the silver wolf didn't fall. He grabbed the attacker's wrist, snapping the bone with a sickening crunch, and drove his own elbow into the man's temple. The attacker dropped like a stone. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant wail of sirens. Jayu stood swaying, his hand pressed to his side. Warm, sticky blood leaked through his fingers, staining his white shirt a dark, ruinous red. He turned to Jemima. She was staring at the blood, her eyes wide with horror. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, the taste of copper filling his mouth. "Me?" She stepped forward, her hands hovering over his wound, terrified to touch him. "Jayu, oh God, you're bleeding." "It's nothing," he lied, gritting his teeth against the searing agony. He grabbed her hand, his grip bloody but unbreakable. "We have to move, now." The apartment smelled of vanilla and rain, a jarring, soft contrast to the metallic tang of blood filling the air. Jayu collapsed onto the beige sofa, his vision graying at the edges. The adrenaline that had driven him through the glass and gunfire was evaporating, leaving behind a searing line of fire in his side and a bone-deep exhaustion. "Stay still," Jemima commanded. Her voice trembled, but her hands were steady. She knelt beside him with a first-aid kit, small, domestic, woefully inadequate for the violence he lived in, but she made it work. She took a pair of scissors to his ruined bespoke shirt, cutting through the blood-soaked silk. As she peeled the fabric away, Jayu flinched. It wasn't the pain of the wound that made him recoil, it was the exposure. He was the silver wolf, and now he was laid bare. The massive tattoo of the wolf snarled across his chest and shoulder, the silver ink intertwining with jagged, ugly scars, a roadmap of a decade of brutality. He waited for her to scream. He waited for the disgust to twist her features when she saw the monster beneath the suit. But she didn't pull away. Jemima cleaned the wound with a wet cloth, her touch firm but incredibly gentle. Her eyes didn't dart away in fear. They traced the scar tissue near his heart with a profound, aching sadness. "You've been hurting for a long time," she whispered, her fingers grazing a particularly old, jagged mark. "Don't," Jayu rasped, grabbing her wrist. His grip was weak, desperate. "Don't look at me like I can be saved. I'm broken, Jemima, not just the cuts." The confession clawed its way up his throat, a toxic secret he had kept locked away for 10 years. He needed her to know. He needed her to run. "I am a dead end," he choked out, staring at the ceiling to avoid her eyes. "Sterile. The doctors, there is nothing inside me that works. I can't give life. I can only take it. You are wasting your mercy on a ghost." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. He braced himself for her pity, or worse, her departure. Instead, she moved closer. Jemima didn't speak. She simply placed her hand flat against his lower abdomen, her palm warm against his cold, clammy skin. The reaction was instantaneous. It hit him harder than the knife. A shockwave of heat surged from her touch, violent and electric, racing through his veins and pooling heavily in his groin. His body, which medical science had declared a wasteland, roared into immediate, undeniable life. He hardened against his will, a painful, throbbing proof of vitality that shattered his reality. Jayu gasped, his back arching off the sofa, his eyes snapping to hers in shock. Jemima held his gaze, her hand pressing firmer, feeling the rapid, powerful thrum of his pulse beneath her fingers and the physical evidence of his desire. She didn't look frightened. She looked triumphant. "You aren't broken, Jayu," she breathed, leaning in until her breath ghosted against his lips. "You were just waiting." The sun that filtered through Jemima's curtains wasn't the gray, filtered light of the city he knew. It was golden, heavy, and warm. Hyun Jayu woke before the alarm, his body humming with a strange, foreign energy. For a decade, waking up had felt like dragging a corpse out of a grave. Today, he felt like a god. He sat up, the movement pulling at the fresh stitches in his side, but the pain was distant, irrelevant. The hollowness that had defined his existence, the cold, sterile emptiness in his gut, was gone. In its place was a furnace of vitality, a deep, resonant power that coursed through his blood. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. The tremors of the dead man walking had vanished. He slid out of bed, careful not to wake the woman sleeping beside him. Jemima lay tangled in the sheets, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Looking at her, Jayu felt a possessiveness so intense it almost brought him to his knees. She hadn't just saved his life. She had rewritten his biology. He walked to the window, looking out at the skyline. The Red Dragon Syndicate was still out there, thinking they were hunting a wounded animal. They were wrong. They were hunting a father protecting his nest. He picked up his phone. It was time to clean the house. "Boss," the lieutenant's voice was ragged, expecting bad news. "Mobilize the elite guard," Jayu said. His voice wasn't the gravelly growl of yesterday. It was calm, cold, and absolute. The Red Dragons attacked a civilian target. They crossed the line. "What are the orders, sir? Do we push them back?" "No," Jayu said, watching a hawk circle the sky above the skyscrapers. "You don't push back a disease, you cut it out. Burn their warehouses, seize their accounts. I want the Red Dragon name erased from this city by noon. Leave nothing standing." "Understood, consider it done." He hung up, the phone clicking shut on the war. It was over. The wolf had returned to his throne, not to die but to rule. He turned back to the bed just as Jemima stirred. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and then suddenly pressed a hand to her mouth, her complexion paling slightly. A wave of morning nausea seemed to hit her out of nowhere. Jayu was at her side in an instant, not with panic, but with a sudden, dawning realization. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his dark eyes scanning her face. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I'm fine," she murmured, the wave passing. "Just a little dizzy, it's strange." Jayu reached out. His large, tattooed hand covered hers, which was still resting on her flat stomach. He felt the warmth there, the vibration of life that his instincts had screamed about from the moment he saw her in the blue dress. The doctors had called him sterile. The science had called him broken. But as he felt the heat radiating from her skin, the silver wolf smiled. A genuine, terrifyingly happy smile. "We should see a doctor," he whispered, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "I have a feeling we have a lot to plan for." The sterile white light of the VVIP delivery suite was ironic. 10 years ago, rooms like this were where Hyun Jayu went to hear sentences of death. They were places of cold diagnoses and ending bloodlines. Today, the room smelled of antiseptic and lavender, but the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Dr. Kang, the same specialist who had looked at Jayu's charts a decade ago and declared him a biological dead end, stood by the monitors. The man was trembling. He wasn't shaking from fear of the mafia boss anymore. He was shaking because he was witnessing a ghost come back to life. "It defies every metric," Dr. Kang whispered, adjusting his glasses as he looked at the ultrasound monitors one last time. "By all accounts, this shouldn't be happening." Jiayu didn't answer. He stood by the head of the bed, his hand gripping Jemima. His knuckles were white, his tattoos stark against the pale hospital sheets. For 9 months he had watched her grow, watched the impossible swell of her stomach, treating her with a reverence usually reserved for deities. He had fortified their home, decimated his enemies, and turned Seoul into a fortress, all for this moment. But now, staring at Jemima's exhausted, sweat-sheened face, the silver wolf felt a fear that no bullet had ever instilled in him. "One more push, Jemima," the nurse urged softly. "You're almost there." Jemima squeezed his hand, her nails digging into his palm, grounding him. She let out a sharp, guttural cry, a sound of raw power that echoed the strength she had shown him that first night in the gallery. Then the world stopped. A cry pierced the air. It was high, clear, and furious, a demand for existence. Jiayu stopped breathing. The doctor moved quickly, wrapping the small, squirming bundle in a warm blanket before turning around. His eyes were wide above his mask. "It's a boy," Dr. Kang said, his voice thick with disbelief. "A healthy, perfect boy." He passed the bundle to Jemima. She collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face, a smile breaking through the exhaustion that lit up the entire room. She looked down at the child, then up at Jiayu. "Jiayu," she whispered, "come meet him." Jiayu stepped forward. His legs, usually steady in the face of explosions and carnage, felt weak. He reached out, his large, scarred hands trembling as he took the weight of his son. The baby was tiny, yet he felt heavier than the world. He had a tuft of dark hair and skin that glowed with warmth. Slowly, the infant opened his eyes. They were dark, sharp, and alert. Jiayu stared at the face of the impossible. The doctors had said his line ended with him. They said he was a monster incapable of creation. But here, resting in the crook of his arm, was the future. He brushed his thumb against the baby's soft cheek, avoiding the rough ink of his own fingers. The baby turned toward his touch, quieting instantly. "The wolf has a cub," Jemima said softly, watching them. Jiayu looked at her, then back at his son. The cold, suicidal man who had walked into the art gala looking for an end was gone, buried in the ashes of the past. "No," Jiayu whispered, pressing a kiss to the infant's forehead. "The wolf has a king." Thank you for listening till the end. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Where in the world are you turning in from? Let me know in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. I appreciate the time you spent here with me today.